Welcome back to Biblical Greek Tidbits. In this presentation, we'll take a brief look at the very important concept of verbal aspect as it applies to the Greek New Testament. I have hesitated to make this presentation because of the complicated nature of many of the problems raised by this concept. However, I felt that I should at least introduce the idea of verbal aspect. The interested viewer will, at a minimum, study the references listed below to gain a more complete understanding of this important concept. Here's a list of the references used in this presentation. If you want to take a closer look at these references, please pause the video. One of the hottest research areas today in Greek studies is the concept of verbal aspect. While this concept has been around a long time, it is receiving renewed interest in the academic world. We will not enter into all the nuances of verbal aspect in this presentation, but only skim the surface, mostly in the form of a few examples of this difficult subject. We will also provide some definitions of a limited number of related terms. I have hesitated to give a presentation of this concept because it does get rather complicated in some of its details. I must admit that some of my previous videos did not accurately or appropriately take verbal aspect into account. There's a huge ongoing discussion about 1, how many verbal aspects there are in the Greek language, 2, how time, tense, and verbal aspect viewpoint relate to each other, 3, is time/verbal aspect encoded into the verb itself, or are these discerned from the context and other factors of the passage? 4, is time as significant as verbal aspect in the Greek verbal system? In other words, which is primary and which is secondary? 5, how is the future tense to be categorized? 6, how does Koine Greek differ from classical Greek and modern Greek? The verbs in the indicative mood encode time as well as verbal aspect. 8, the significance of the epsilon augment in the Greek language, and a number of others. It is well beyond the scope of this presentation to attempt to address all or even a significant number of these issues. We will only look at a few examples to distinguish between verbal tense and verbal aspect. This is a subset of a much larger question of how tense, aspect, and mood relate to each other. For our examples, we have assumed the Porter view, see references 3, 6, 9, and 10, of verbal aspect. That is, verbal aspect is evidenced in 3 ways: perfective, imperfective, and stative. Here are some relevant definitions for this presentation. Tense, time of the action or state of the verb. Note that we're not using the word tense as used historically by the various morphological forms of the Greek tense system. Verbal aspect, definition 1. A synthetic semantic category realized in the form of verbs, used of meaningful oppositions in a network of tense systems to grammaticalize the author's reasoned, subjective choice of conception of a process. This is Stanley Porter's definition given on page 88 of reference 3. This is a semantic value. See definition of verbal semantics on the following slide. Note 1. Definition 1 is a more technical definition of verbal aspect for those with some linguistic training. Verbal aspect definition 2. How the author chooses to conceive of or view the action. From reference 8, page 112. According to Porter, this is expressed through one of three aspects: perfective aspect, imperfective aspect, or stative aspect. See the following slide for definitions of these three aspects. Note 2. Definition 2 is a less technical definition, essentially for those without significant linguistic training. Note 3. Most modern scholars say that Greek verb forms predominantly indicate aspect rather than time or type of action. There's disagreement among scholars about the relationship of time and aspect in the indicative mood. Aktionsart, a German term that indicates the type of objective action represented by the verb, iterative, punctiliar, durative, ingressive, etc. That is, how the action actually unfolds, regardless of how the speaker or author chooses to view the action. Temporal deictic indicators. In the framework of verbal aspect, these are contextual factors that indicate temporal relationships, such as adverbs, adjectives, prepositions, conjunctions, and many words that carry temporal meaning, such as age, beginning, childhood, etc. Verbal semantics. In this presentation, this is defined as the fundamental meaning of the Greek verb with regard to its verbal aspect, which, see previous definition, as expressed through various Greek tenses. Verbal pragmatics. In this presentation, this is defined as the full meaning of the verb as it is used in a particular context, which could, for example, be as small as a single sentence or as large as an entire pericope or an entire book in the Greek New Testament. Note, the full subject of the relationship between semantics and pragmatics is a very complicated one in the field of linguistics. A major related topic centers around various views on polysemy and monosemy. Basically, polysemy is the ability of words, signs, and symbols to have multiple meanings, while monosemy is the property of terms having a single meaning. These topics are well beyond the scope of this presentation. Perfective aspect. The author or speaker chooses the form of the aorist tense to portray the action of the verb as complete without regard to its progress or lack of progress. Imperfective aspect. The author or speaker chooses the present or imperfect tense to portray the action of the verb as in process or ongoing without regard to the beginning or ending. Stative aspect. The author or speaker chooses the perfect tense or the pluperfect tense to portray a resulting state of affairs in which there is no change without regard to any progress of the action. In the past, before the 20th century, it was asserted and taught in Greek grammars that the form of the Greek verb indicates either time of action or type of action, or later in some cases both. More recently, particularly in the last 50 years or so, most scholars have asserted that the Greek verb chiefly indicates verbal aspect rather than time or type of action. For a history of these changes in outlook, refer to references 1 through 5 above. I most particularly recommend reference 4 by Rodney Decker for a concise history of the development of how the Greek verb was viewed over time from the late 19th century to those like me who have limited familiarity with the field of linguistics. Dr. Decker's book tests Porter's theory of verbal aspect against the Gospel of Mark. For a more detailed study of verbal aspect based on modern linguistic theory, I recommend reference 3. There is much discussion among scholars on whether there is a clear distinction between the semantics of a verb and the related pragmatics of the verb. For a brief introduction to semantics versus pragmatics, see page 22 through 24 of reference 5. This discussion gets into some deeper questions that are best dealt with by looking at the field of linguistics, which is well beyond the scope of this presentation. According to some scholars, if there's a clear distinction between semantics and pragmatics, one is led to the conclusion that time is not encoded in the morphology of the Greek verb. On the other hand, other scholars, such as Bruce Fanning, who admits he is not a linguist, hold that there is, at least in the indicative mood, a blurring of the distinction between semantics and pragmatics, and are led to the conclusion that time in the indicative mood is encoded in the Greek verb. We will next look at some examples taken from Stanley Porter's Intermediate Grammar, see reference 6. To keep this presentation fairly short, we will only look at uses of the perfect, aorist, and present tenses, omitting therefore the pluperfect, imperfect, and future tenses. See other examples with past, present, future, omnitemporal, and timeless references for all Greek tenses in reference 6. Note, there's disagreement among scholars about the aspectual nature, if any, of the Greek future tense. Example 1 is from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 15. Perfect tense with past time reference. Ioannis martyri peri avtu ke krekaien legon. Translation, John testified about him and cried out, saying. Here, kekraien is stative aspect, third person singular, perfect tense, active voice, indicative mood of the verb kradzo. Note, there is no idea of ongoing result of the verbal action in this use of the perfect, as has traditionally been taught for the perfect tense. Also, notice the use of the historic present in martyri. Example 2 is from Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 26, perfect tense with present time reference. Apokrithi aptis Ioannis legon, ego baptizo en idati, mesos imon estiken on imis ug idate. Translation, John answered them, saying, I baptize in water, but among you stands one whom you do not know. Here, estiken is stative aspect, third person singular, perfect tense, active voice, indicative mood of the verb istemi. Example 3 is from Jude, the 14th verse. Idou ilthen Kyrios and Aies Myriasin avtu. Translation, behold, the Lord will come with his countless saints. This is based on a translation by Stanley Porter. Here, ilthen is perfect aspect, third person singular, aorist tense, active voice, indicative mood of the verb erchome. Example 4 is from Romans 5, verse 11. Aorist tense with present time reference. Umanan the Allah ke kafkomeni endau theo diatu Kyriou imon Jesu Christou diu nin tin katalayin elavamen. Translation, and not only this, but we also exult in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we now receive reconciliation. This is based on a translation by Stanley Porter. Here, elavamen is perfective aspect, first person plural, aorist tense, active voice, indicative mood of the verb lamvano. Example 5 is from the 10th chapter of Acts, verse 11. Present tense with past time reference. Ke theori ton uranon aneogmenon. Translation, and he saw the sky opened up. Here, theori is imperfective aspect, third person singular, present tense, active voice, indicative mood of the verb theame. This is sometimes referred to as an historic present. Note that example 1 also used an historic present. Example 6 is from the 26th chapter of Acts, verse 2. Present tense with future time reference. Iastu anthropu parodidate. Translation, the Son of Man will be delivered up. Here, parodidate is imperfective aspect, third person singular, present tense, passive voice, indicative mood of the verb parodidome. Many, if not most, elementary New Testament Greek grammars teach something like the following. The aorist, imperfect, and pluperfect tenses encode past time. The present and perfect tenses encode present time, with the usual caveat that the perfect tense really speaks of an action in past time with present time ramifications. The future tense encodes future time. An exception to this is the Porter/Reed O'Donnell Elementary Grammar, Fundamentals of New Testament Greek, published by Eerdmans in 2010. I'm sure there are probably other exceptions now as well. The examples given in this presentation from Porter's Intermediate Grammar, reference 6, demonstrate that various tenses can be used in the context of various temporal situations. Thus, for example, the aorist tense is not used exclusively for past temporal reference, nor is the present tense used exclusively for present temporal reference. See reference 6 for a more complete set of examples. In this presentation, we have barely scratched the surface of the important concept of verbal aspect. Please refer to the references for additional information. Thank you for watching this presentation. As always, I defer to real scholars on all matters of biblical Greek.